The Myth of the Sun, God, the Cosmos, and What Worship Really Means. Written and narrated by Eric Leo. The Myth of the Sun by Eric Leo. Introduction. This book is the third movement in a longer line of inquiry. In the first book of what can best be described as a series exploring the relationship between science and religion, 108, the story of discovering Earth's consciousness, I described the personal and intellectual path that led me to take seriously an idea most dismiss outright, that the Earth may be conscious, or at least conscious-like, in ways we do not yet understand. The second book, Cosmic Love, How Earth Might Be Using Artists to Speak, extended that inquiry by attempting to observe, test, and catalog possible forms of communication between human cognition and planetary systems. Specifically, Gaia, using pattern recognition, psychology, and environmental feedback as tools rather than faith. The Myth of the Sun begins where those books leave off. It steps back from personal experience and places the theory in historical context. It asks a different question. If planets and stars are conscious, or if they behave in ways that meaningfully resemble intelligence, why does the idea feel radical now when it once seemed obvious? Human beings have always looked to the sky for explanation. Long before science, before philosophy, before written language, the heavens were the most stable and powerful features of human experience. The sun determined when we woke, when we slept, when food grew, and when it failed. Its movement marked time. Its absence meant danger. Its return meant survival. To early humans, this is not symbolism. It was daily fact. This book argues that what we now call mythology was not naive superstition, but early systems modeling. The gods were not imaginary in the way modern skeptics assume. They were misunderstood forces, natural systems interpreted through observation rather than instruments. The sun was not worshipped because ancient people were ignorant. It was revered because it governed life with absolute consistency. Modernity claims to have outgrown these myths. Nietzsche famously declared that God was dead, and in many ways, he was right. But the death of God did not end belief, it fractured it, meaning splintered into science, religion, politics, and identity, each trying to answer questions they were never designed to hold alone. Atheism works well in practice. It builds planes, cures disease, and predicts eclipses. But often it fails existentially, leaving no coherent answer to why any of this matters. My own position sits uneasily between these camps. I am an atheist in behavior. I do not act on faith, submit to authority, or accept claims without evidence. If something deserves to be called God, it should be discoverable, testable, and self-evident in the natural world. Denial of traditional gods led me not away from meaning, but deeper into it. I sought what I doubted, and what I doubted was faith and belief itself. At the same time, I am a pantheist in theory. As this book will argue, planets and stars possess godlike qualities in ways that are far more consistent with history, physics, and evolution than the anthropomorphic deities most modern religions defend. Consciousness may not be exclusive to brains. It may emerge at scale through feedback loops, magnetism, gravity, and time. If that is true, then the original idea of God did not disappear. It was renamed. This perspective owes much to thinkers who never framed their work as religious at all. Carl Sagan, whose Pale Blue Dot remains one of the most formative books, described a universe governed by awe, humility, and interdependence without appealing to superstition. Sagan was, in effect, a pantheist who spoke the language of science. He understood that reverence does not require obedience, and that wonder does not require belief in the supernatural. We sent Voyager into the void carrying a message, images, sounds, and coordinates meant to announce ourselves and ask, in a way, for help. But what if help was already here? What if we were standing on a planetary system capable of teaching us how to live sustainably, communicate across intelligence scales, and survive long enough to meet whatever else exists? The problem may not be the absence of intelligence, but our refusal to recognize it when it does not look like us. Mythology is best understood as pre-scientific modeling rather than superstition. It encodes repeated observation into narrative form, allowing humans to track patterns of cause, consequence, and constraint without formal theory. Myths compress observation into story. They turn slow, large-scale patterns into narratives that can be remembered, taught, and acted upon across generations. In this way, mythology functioned as an early form of systems thinking, describing how life responds to recurring constraints long before those constraints could be measured or modeled mathematically. The myth of the sun is not an attack on religion, nor is it an endorsement of it. It is an attempt to translate ancient belief into modern understanding, to show that science did not disprove the gods so much as absorb them. When mythology is read literally, it fails. When read figuratively, it becomes a record of humanity's early attempts to understand a living cosmos. This book does not ask you to believe. It asks you to reconsider what belief has always been pointing toward. The Myth of the Sun by Eric Leo. Chapter 1. The death of God didn't kill belief. It fragmented it. When Friedrich Nietzsche declared that God was dead, he was not celebrating. He was diagnosing. What he saw coming was not liberation, but disorientation. A civilization that had organized its values, ethics, and sense of purpose around a single metaphysical center had lost that center, and nothing equally coherent had replaced it. Modern readers often misunderstand this moment. God did not vanish because science disproved him. He vanished because the old explanation no longer scaled. Astronomy displaced the heavens. Biology displaced special creation. Geology displaced eternal worlds. Psychology displaced the soul as a simple object. Each advance explained something better than theology had, but none of them explained everything. The result was not disbelief, it was fragmentation. Belief did not disappear. It broke apart and scattered across new domains. Meaning moved into nationalism, progress, markets, ideology, identity, and technology. Science became the tool for understanding how the world works, but it was never designed to answer why it should matter. Religion continued to answer the why, but increasingly did so using metaphors that no longer matched what we knew about the universe. Atheism in this context is not a failure. It is an honest response to bad explanations. In practice, atheism works. It demands evidence. It rewards skepticism. It builds systems that function whether or not anyone believes in them. Bridges do not collapse because someone prayed incorrectly. Medicine does not fail because a patient doubted hard enough. In every domain where precision matters, disbelief performs better than faith. And yet, atheism often fails where humans are most vulnerable. It struggles with grief, purpose, awe, and obligation beyond self-interest. It explains how things happen, but rarely why anyone should care. For many people, this leaves a vacuum. When belief is removed without being replaced by something meaningful, people do not become rational. They become unmoored. This tension defines modernity. We live in a world built by disbelief, while still psychologically shaped by belief. We inherit religious instincts without religious consensus. We crave meaning but distrust metaphysics. We reject gods but continue to search for something that behaves like one. My own position emerges from this fracture. I am an atheist in practice because I do not accept authority without evidence. I do not obey commands because they are attributed to divinity. I do not suspend skepticism when claims become emotionally comforting. If something is real, it should withstand examination. If it cannot, it does not deserve obedience. But denial of traditional gods did not end my search. It redirected it. If there is something worthy of the word God, it should not require belief to function. It should be evident in the structure of reality itself. It should not be jealous, personal, or offended by doubt. It should operate whether or not humans acknowledge it. This line of thinking eventually leads back to the same place ancient humans began, the sky. Before doctrines, before scriptures, before institutions, there was the sun. Not as symbol, but as system. The sun did not demand belief. It enforced consequence. Crops grew or failed based on its movement. Bodies synchronized to its rhythm. Entire ecosystems rose and fell in response to its energy. If there was ever a force that justified reverence without mythology, it was the star at the center of our solar system. What modern readers call sun worship is often framed as a primitive error. This misses the point entirely. Early humans did not anthropomorphize the sun out of ignorance. They personified it because personification was the only available language for agency. When something controls life, time, and death with perfect regularity, attributing intention is not irrational. It is an observation. The same mistake is made when modern critics dismiss planetary gods as fantasy. Mercury was not worshipped because people believed a literal figure flew through the sky delivering messages. He was associated with communication because the planet's movement correlated with cycles that affected trade, travel, and exchange. Mars was not a cartoon god of violence. Its irregular, reddish presence in the sky aligned with disruption, conflict, and instability. These were not moral claims. They were pattern recognition. Mythology, in this light, was not false. It was incomplete. It molded complex systems using narrative instead of mathematics. It described relationships rather than mechanisms. When science arrived, it replaced the language but not the underlying structure. Gravity took the place of gods. Orbits replaced intentions. Energy replaced spirit. The functions remained. Only metaphors changed. This is why science did not truly kill the gods. It renamed them. The modern problem is that we kept the names of the old metaphors while abandoning their original reference. God became abstract, omnipotent, and untestable. The universe became mechanical, inert, and dead. Consciousness was confined to skulls. Meaning was downgraded to preference. In solving one problem, we created another. The ancients did not imagine a dead universe animated by imagination. They lived in a universe that was visibly alive, moving, responsive, and powerful. The heavens changed. The seasons returned. The stars rotated. Everything meaningful came from above and below, not from human opinion. Their mistake wasn't reverence. Respect the world. Treat nature and existence as something sacred wasn't the problem. The mistake was over-anthropomorphism, taking that reverence and pushing it too far by projecting human emotions, motives, and personality onto the sun, storms, oceans, and the gods as if the universe literally thinks and feels like we do. Our mistake today may be the opposite. We avoid anthropomorphism so aggressively that we treat nature as dead matter, just atoms, resources, and chemistry, so we lose reverence entirely. In short, the ancients respected the world but humanized it too much. We dehumanized it so much we stopped respecting it at all. We now understand feedback loops, emergence, self-regulation, and systems behavior. We know that intelligence does not require a single brain. Ant colonies solve problems. Ecosystems adapt. Neural networks learn. Complex behavior emerges from simple rules operating at scale. And yet, when these same principles are applied to planets, stars, or galaxies, we retreat into metaphor and insist the universe must be inert. This insistence is philosophical, not scientific. Science describes what can be measured. It does not declare what is meaningful. When we say the universe is dead, we are not making an observation. We are making an assumption. One inherited from a worldview that stripped agency from nature to reserve it for humans or for a transcendent God. The irony is that this leaves us with neither. The death of God did not free us from belief. It left us believing in fragments. We worship growth, consumption, and dominance while insisting we worship nothing at all. The old gods were at least tied to natural limits. The new ones are not. This blog argues that meaning did not disappear when belief collapsed. It became harder to see because we stopped looking where it originated. Not in text, not in institutions, but the systems that make life possible. The sun did not stop governing existence because we learned nuclear fission. The earth did not stop regulating life because we learned ecology. These discoveries made the systems more impressive, not less. If there is something godlike in the universe, it will not look like a man on a throne. It will look like structure, constraint, and continuity. It will operate through physics, not miracles. It will be powerful, but not absolute. Intelligent, but not personal. Benevolent, not because it intervenes, but because it sustains. The ancient world senses this intuitively. The modern world forgot how to articulate it. The chapters that follow do not ask you to return to belief. They ask you to recognize that belief was never the point. The point is orientation, understanding where we are, what sustains us, and how to live in alignment with forces far larger than ourselves. The myth of the sun was humanity's first attempt to answer those questions. It may not have been wrong. It may have simply been early. The Myth of the Sun by Eric Leo. Chapter 2. What the myth of the sun actually is. The phrase myth of the sun tends to trigger a reflexive misunderstanding. In modern language, myth is often treated as a synonym for falsehood. A myth is something untrue that people once believed before they knew better. Reframed that way, the entire project collapses before it begins. That definition is wrong. A myth is not a lie. A myth is an explanation told in the best language available at the time. It is a model of reality built without instruments, equations, or written theory. It is how human beings made sense of forces they could not control but could not ignore. The myth of the sun was humanity's first serious attempt to explain why life exists, persists, and ends. The sun was not one object among many. It was the condition for everything else. Without it, there was no warmth, no growth, no agriculture, no rhythm to sleep and waking, no reliable passage of time. Its daily movement structured behavior. Its seasonal changes structured survival. Its disappearance each night introduced danger. Its return each morning resolved it. In this sense, the sun was not symbolic of life. It was life. This is the foundation modern readers often miss. Ancient people did not start with gods and project them onto the sky. They started with the sky and derived gods from observation. The sun rose, the sun set, the sun returned. Everything meaningful followed that pattern. Birth, maturity, decay, death, and renewal all mirrored the solar cycle. Once you notice this, it becomes impossible not to see it everywhere. Time itself was solar before it was abstract. Days were measured by sunlight. Years were marked by solstices and equinoxes. History was not counted forward into infinity but cycled, like the seasons. When the sun failed to appear on schedule, civilizations panicked. When it returned, they celebrated. This is not superstition. It was risk assessment. To call this worship misunderstands the relationship. Worship implies choice. Early humans did not choose to revere the sun. They responded to its authority. The sun governed whether children survived winter, whether crops matured, whether animals migrated or starved. There was no appeal process. No moral argument could override it. The sun was impartial, predictable, and absolute within its domain. These are precisely the qualities later attributed to gods. The myth of the sun emerges when humans begin asking not what happens, but why it happens this way. Why does the sun move? Why does it disappear? Why does it return weaker in the winter and stronger in summer? Why does its absence feel like death and its return rebirth? Without physics, the answers had to be narrative. The sun became a traveler, a judge, a witness. It crossed the sky by day and the underworld by night. It died and was reborn. It observed human action and regulated consequence, not through moral judgment, but through environmental response. If you planted at the wrong time, you failed. If you ignored the seasons, you suffered. This is where the idea of divine order begins, not as commandment, but as constraint. The sun imposed rules without explanation. You could learn them, align with them, or violate them and pay the price. Over time, these constraints became moralized. Good behavior aligned with cosmic order. Bad behavior disrupted it. This was not because the universe cared about virtue in the abstract, but because societies that aligned themselves with natural cycles survived longer than those that did not. The myth of the sun, then, is not about celestial personalities. It's about pattern recognition. It is about realizing that life is not random, that it responds to forces larger than human will, and that those forces can be studied, anticipated, and respected. Seen this way, mythology begins to resemble early science. Different cultures told different stories, but the structure remained remarkably consistent. The sun was always central. It was always associated with life, time, death, and rebirth. It was often depicted as a father, a king, or a lawgiver, not because it resembled a human ruler, but because it ruled outcomes. Authority followed effect, not intention. Modern readers often ask why ancient people did not simply notice that the sun was a ball of fire. The answer is simple. They noticed what mattered. Knowing the sun's composition would not help you survive a drought. Knowing its timing would. Knowledge evolves to meet necessity, not curiosity. What we now call astronomy began as survival strategy. Tracking the sun was not metaphysical speculation. It was agriculture, navigation, and governance. The earliest calendars were not philosophical tools. They were food systems. Miss the planting window and you starve. Miss the harvest and you die. The sun made these windows visible. As societies grew, the myth expanded. The sun became entangled with kinship, law, and legitimacy. Rulers aligned themselves with solar cycles. Empires claimed divine mandate through celestial order. This was not accidental. Control over timekeeping and seasonal prediction translated directly into power. If you could say when floods would come, when the sun would turn, when the year would renew, you could organize labor, taxation, and ritual. Here myth becomes political, but it does not become arbitrary. The authority still flows from the same source, the sun's control over life. The critical mistake modern readers make is assuming that once a phenomenon is explained mechanistically, its earlier interpretations become meaningless. This confuses explanation with significance. Knowing that the sun's energy comes from nuclear fission does not reduce its importance. It amplifies it. The more we understand the sun's role, the clearer it becomes that early humans were responding to something real. They simply lacked our language. The myth of the sun is best understood as humanity's first systems theory. It links energy input to biological output. It connects cycles to stability. It recognizes that life exists within constraints that cannot be negotiated. It encodes this understanding in stories because stories were the only way to preserve and transmit complex ideas across generations. When read literally, these myths fail. When read structurally, they are remarkably accurate. This book does not argue that the sun is a god in the modern religious sense. It argues that the sun was humanity's first encounter with a force that behaved as gods were later described: life-giving, timekeeping, indifferent to human desire, yet essential to human survival. Once this is understood, the rest of mythology begins to fall in place. The sun was not the exception. It was the template. The Myth of the Sun by Eric Leo. Chapter 3. The Sun as the First God. Once the sun is understood as a system rather than a symbol, its elevation to dignity becomes almost inevitable. The sun was the first force humans encountered that met every practical criterion later assigned to gods. It gave life without asking permission. It structured time without explanation. It punished ignorance without malice. And it did all of this consistently across generations, cultures, and continents. This consistency matters. Unlike storms, animals, or rival tribes, the sun behaved predictably. It did not negotiate. It did not respond to prayer in an obvious way. It did not change its path to accommodate human desire, and yet everything human depended on it. This combination of power and indifference is precisely what gave the sun its authority. It was not powerful because it cared. It was powerful because it did not have to. In early societies, authority always followed consequence. The thing that determined survival became the thing that organized meaning. The sun rose to that position not through imagination, but through elimination. Anything less central could not compete. Rain mattered, but rain was intermittent. Animals mattered, but animals migrated. The land mattered, but land without sunlight was dead. The sun was constant enough to trust and absolute enough to fear. This is why solar deities appear independently across civilizations with no contact. Ra in Egypt, Helios and later Sol in the Greco-Roman world, Surya in India, Inti among the Inca. These were not copies of one original story. They were parallel conclusions drawn from the same observation. When different cultures look at the same system long enough, they arrive at similar abstractions. Each solar god shares a core set of attributes. They are life-givers. They are timekeepers. They are judges, not in a moral sense, but in an outcome-based one. They see all, not because they are omniscient minds, but because nothing escapes daylight. They are associated with kinship, not because they resemble rulers, but because rulers depend on the same cycles of growth, taxation, and stability that the sun governs. The sun was not imagined as a god because humans needed comfort. It was recognized as godlike because it functioned that way. The recognition shaped how divinity itself was defined. A god was not initially a creator ex nihilo. A god was a regulator, a force that maintained order through repetition. Creation myths come later. Governance came first. The sun did not create the world in myth because creation was not the urgent problem. Survival was. Over time, as societies became more complex, the sun's role expanded symbolically. It became associated not with crops and seasons, but with law, truth, and moral order. This shift is subtle but important. As human societies layered ethical systems on top of ecological constraints, the sun's impartiality became a model for justice. It treated everyone the same. It illuminated everything equally. It punished without bias. This is the origin of the watchful God. The idea that a God sees all does not originate in abstract morality. It originates in daylight. Crimes committed in darkness felt different not because of theology, but because the sun's absence changed accountability. When the sun returned, so did visibility. The moral language followed the physical reality, not the other way around. As mythology evolved, solar narratives absorbed local concerns. In agricultural societies, the sun was gentle but demanding. In imperial societies, it became triumphant and authoritative. In desert cultures, it was harsh and absolute. Those differences do not undermine the pattern. They confirm it. The sun was interpreted through lived experience, not imposed doctrine. Nowhere is this clearer than in the transition from overt solar worship to more abstract religious forms. By the time monotheism emerged, the sun had already been conceptually internalized. Its functions did not disappear. They were reassigned. God became the source of light, the arbiter of time, the judge of actions, the witness to history. The language shifted, but the architecture remained. This is why solar imagery saturates later religious traditions, even when explicit sun worship is denied. Light becomes synonymous with truth, darkness with ignorance or evil. Resurrection aligns with seasonal return. Sacred days align with solstices and equinoxes. They are not coincidences. They are inheritance. One of the most controversial implications of this inheritance appears in Christianity. When examined historically rather than devotionally, the figure of Jesus maps cleanly onto the solar archetype. This does not require hostility to the teachings attributed to him, nor does it require certainty about his historical existence. It requires only pattern recognition. Jesus is called the light of the world. He is associated with rebirth, resurrection, and eternal life. His death and return follow a symbolic cycle rather than a biological one. His story centers on sacrifice followed by renewal. Even the timing of Christian holidays aligns not with the documented events, but with solar milestones. The winter solstice becomes Christmas. The spring equinox becomes Easter. Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper offers a visual example of this inheritance. The 12 disciples align naturally with months or seasons, with Jesus positioned as the central solar figure. This is not hidden knowledge or conspiracy. It is standard symbolic composition, drawing on a visual language already thousands of years old. When the sun sets, it appears to descend into the horizon, often reflected across water. In this context, phrases like walking on water take on metaphorical clarity that literal readings miss. The sun does not obey physics as a human does. It appears to transcend boundaries because it is not constrained by them in the same way. None of this diminishes the ethical teachings attributed to Jesus. If anything, it strengthens them. Moral instruction does not require literal divinity to be valuable. What it does require is resonance with human experience. Solar mythology provided a narrative framework powerful enough to carry those teachings across cultures and centuries. Seen this way, Christianity did not invent a new God. It translated an old one. The same is true across religious history. As knowledge increased, gods became less localized and more abstract. The sun was no longer a disk crossing the sky. It became a source of divine light beyond the physical world. This abstraction made the concept portable, but it also severed it from observation. God became harder to test, harder to question, and eventually immune to falsification. This is where mythology begins to lose its grounding. The original sun god could fail crops. It could cause famine. It could be predicted, tracked, and feared with precision. Later gods could not. They became moral authorities without physical constraint. In gaining omnipotence, they lost accountability. The sun never made that trade. It remains the same system it has always been. It still governs life, time, and death within its domain. It still does not care what humans believe about it, and it still holds the same power it always has, regardless of how we name it. The argument of this chapter is not that the sun is a god in the theological sense. It is that the sun was the original reference point from which the idea of God emerged. Later deities inherited its attributes without inheriting its limitations. In doing so, they gained authority but lost coherence. Understanding the sun as the first god is not a return to primitive belief. It is a recognition that humanity's earliest theology was grounded in observation. The error was not reverence. The error came later, when the reverence was detached from the systems that earned it. The next step is to ask whether the sun was unique or whether it was simply the most obvious member of a larger pattern written across the sky. The Myth of the Sun by Eric Leo. Chapter 4. Solar Gods Across Cultures. One pattern, many names. Once the sun is recognized as the original reference point for divinity, the repetition across cultures stops looking coincidental. Civilizations separated by oceans and millennia arrived at remarkably similar conclusions, not because they shared myths, but because they shared dependence. The sun governed survival everywhere. The stories followed naturally. In ancient Egypt, the sun appeared as Ra, the ruler of order, time, and kinship. Ra did not merely light the world. He sustained Ma'at, the cosmic balance that kept chaos at bay. Pharaohs claimed legitimacy by aligning themselves with him, not as prophets, but as extensions of solar order. To rule against the sun's rhythm was to invite collapse. In the Greek world, the sun took the form of Helios, a tireless witness who crossed the sky each day. Helios was not primarily a moral judge. He was a recorder. He saw what happened in the open. His later Roman counterpart, Sol, became increasingly associated with imperial authority as Rome's political structure demanded cosmic validation. When emperors rose, so did the sun's symbolism. In India, the sun appeared as Surya, sustaining not only crops and seasons, but health, consciousness, and rhythm. Surya's role extended into medicine and bodily cycles, reflecting a culture that paid close attention to internal and external alignment. The sun was not distant, it was intimate. It moved through the body as much as through the sky. Across the Atlantic, the Inca revered Inti, whose favor ensured agriculture stability in a harsh environment. Festivals, architecture, and governance were synchronized to solar movement with extraordinary precision. This was not aesthetic devotion. It was logical necessity. Surviving at altitude required exact timing. The sun provided it. These cultures did not share scriptures. They shared constraints. The differences in solar mythology reflect differences in environment, economy, and social structure, but the core remains intact. The sun is always central. It is always life-giving. It always structures time. It is always impartial. These are not narrative choices. They are empirical observations encoded as story. This repetition exposes a deeper truth throughout the myth itself. Myths are not arbitrary inventions. They are compressions. They condense large, slow, system-level truths into forms that can be remembered, taught, and acted upon. The sun's role in sustaining life operates on scales far beyond individual perception. Myth collapses that scale into human terms without losing the underlying relationship. Once this framework is understood, the expansion of divinity beyond the sun becomes easier to explain. As humans observed the night sky more carefully, patterns emerged that the sun alone could not explain. Planets moved differently than stars. They wandered. They reversed direction. They appeared and disappeared. These movements correlated with changes on Earth, not casually in a modern sense, but relationally. Trade expanded or collapsed. Wars began and ended. Relationships formed and fractured. Empires rose and fell. The planets became secondary gods not because they controlled life absolutely, but because they appeared to modulate it. Each planet acquired a domain that reflected its observed behavior. Mercury's quick movement aligned with communication and exchange. Mars' erratic brightness and red hue aligned with conflict and disruption. Venus's brilliance and regularity aligned with attraction and fertility. Jupiter's size and dominance aligned with authority and expansion. Saturn's slow, distant orbit aligned with limits, time, and decay. This was not superstition in the modern sense. It was early systems thinking. Humans were mapping correlations between celestial cycles and terrestrial outcomes using narrative rather than statistics. Without telescopes or mathematics, story was the only modeling tool available. Importantly, these gods were not moral arbiters in the way later religions demanded. They did not reward belief or punish doubt. They described tendencies. They warned of constraints. They offered orientation, not salvation. If you ignored them, the consequence was not divine wrath. It was misalignment. This is why mythology worked as long as it did. It described reality well enough to guide behavior. It failed only when it was frozen into doctrine and defended against revision. Christianity inherits this entire structure, even as it insists on novelty. When examined historically, Jesus fits cleanly into the solar archetype that preceded him. This does not require hostility toward his teachings, nor certainty about his historical existence. It requires recognizing that his story was shaped using an existing symbolic grammar. Jesus is described as the light of the world. He brings life. He defeats death through return. His narrative centers on sacrifice followed by renewal. His key celebrations align with solar turning points, not documented dates. Even the imagery surrounding his life is saturated with celestial language. This means Christianity is layered. The ethical teachings attributed to Jesus could have been attached to any figure. What gave them endurance was their attachment to a structure already understood across cultures, the myth of the sun. Over time, the metaphor hardened. The sun was no longer the reference. The person became literal. Symbol became history. Allegory became dogma. The same pattern appears again and again in religious evolution. Metaphors that begin as explanations of natural systems become identities to defend. Once this happens, mythology loses flexibility. It stops adapting. It becomes brittle. What is lost in this process is not belief, but literacy. Ancient people understood that stories pointed beyond themselves. Modern literalism insists they terminate in themselves. The irony is that this makes ancient thinkers seem naive when, in reality, they were often more comfortable with abstraction than their descendants. Solar gods across cultures were not competing claims. They were parallel interpretations of the same system. The mistake is treating them as rivals rather than translations. If the sun was the first god, the planets were its grammar. Together, they formed a language for understanding a world governed by cycles, limits, and interdependence. Science would later translate that language into equations, but the underlying structure remained the same. The next question, then, is not whether these gods were real, but whether modern science truly replaced them or simply renamed their functions while forgetting what they once meant. The Myth of the Sun by Eric Leo. Chapter 5. The Planets as Gods. Myth as Pre-Scientific Systems Theory. Once the sun established the template for divinity, the rest of the sky followed naturally. The sun explained life itself, but it did not explain variation. It did not account for why certain periods felt expansive and others constraining, why conflicts seemed to cluster, why eras of stability gave way to collapse. To early observers, the answers appeared to move against the fixed backdrop of the stars. The planets were different. Unlike the stars, which held their position relative to one another, the planets wandered. They brightened and dimmed. They reversed direction. They appeared suddenly and disappeared for long stretches of time. To the ancient eye, this behavior demanded interpretation. Anything that moved independently against the cosmic order was assumed to be active rather than passive. This is where planetary gods originate. Each planet's mythology emerged not from imagination, but from long-term observation. Their symbolic domains align remarkably well with their visible behavior in the sky and the patterns humans associated with their cycles. Mercury, fast and elusive, never strays from the sun. It appears briefly at dawn or dusk, then vanishes. It becomes the god of communication, trade, and transition. Messages arrive quickly and disappear just as fast. Commerce opens and closes in narrow windows. Movement matters more than preeminence. Venus, bright and regular, dominates the sky when it appears. It follows a predictable cycle, alternating between morning and evening prominence. It becomes the god of attraction, beauty, fertility, and relationship. Its visibility commands attention. Its rhythm mirrors biological and social cycles tied to reproduction and bonding. Mars, irregular and red, brightens dramatically during opposition, then fades. Its color evokes blood and fire. It becomes the god of conflict, aggression, and disruption. Wars feel episodic, flaring intensely before receding. Mars does not rule violence in the abstract. It marks periods when instability surfaces. Jupiter, massive and slow-moving, dominates everything near it. It takes years to traverse the sky, lingering long enough to shape eras rather than moments. It becomes the god of authority, expansion, law, and order. Empires rise slowly. Institutions solidify over generations. Jupiter does not act quickly, but when it does, its influence is hard to escape. Saturn, distant and faint, moves at a glacial pace. It takes decades to complete its cycle. It becomes the god of limits, decay, time, and consequence. Saturn does not bring immediate reward or punishment. It brings reckoning. Structures collapse when they exceed their capacity. Morality becomes unavoidable. Scarcity defines wisdom. These assignments were not arbitrary. They were functional. Mythology, at this stage, is not theology. It is systems theory without mathematics. Humans were mapping correlations between celestial motion and terrestrial experiences using narrative as a compression tool. They did not claim the planets caused events directly. They treated them as indicators, stewards, and constraints within a larger order. This distinction matters. Modern critics often dismiss planetary mythology as casually confused, as if ancient people believed planets literally reached down and manipulated human affairs. That is a projection of modern literalism onto ancient abstraction. In practice, planetary gods function more like early statistical models. When certain configurations appeared, societies prepared for instability, abundance, or restraint. The value was not prediction with certainty, but orientation under uncertainty. In this way, mythology performed the same role science does now. It helped humans anticipate outcomes and adjust behavior. The key difference is not accuracy, but resolution. Ancient models were coarse. They described tendencies, not mechanics. Science redefined the picture, but it did not eliminate the need for interpretation. Even now, we speak in metaphors, economic climates, political storms, social pressure, rising tensions. The language changed, but the cognitive habit remained. What ancient people lacked was not rationality, it was instrumentation. When astronomy eventually replaced astrology, the gods did not vanish, they were decomposed. Orbits replaced intentions, mass replaced authority, gravity replaced decree, but the underlying insight survived. Large, slow-moving systems shape smaller, faster ones. Human lives unfold within constraints imposed by forces far beyond individual control. This is why mythology remained silent for so long. It was not trying to explain everything. It was trying to explain what mattered. The rise of science did not prove that the old gods were false. It changed how we describe them. What mythology expressed through personality, story, and intention, science translated into forces, laws, and mechanisms. The sun did not stop governing life when we learned about nuclear fusion. The planets did not stop shaping long-term cycles when we learned about gravity and orbital mechanics. What science removed was not function, but character. In doing so, it gained extraordinary precision. We learned how systems work in exact terms, but we also lost the narrative framework that once helped humans understand how they fit within those systems. The universe became measurable, predictable, and increasingly efficient to manipulate, yet harder to relate to as something meaningful rather than mechanical. The universe became legible, but emotionally silent. Systems still governed outcomes, but no longer felt interpretable. Meaning fractured again. The deeper claim of this book is that mythology and science are not opposites. They are stages. Mythology is what systems theory looks like before measurement. Science is what mythology becomes when instruments arrive. Seen this way, the planets were never false gods. They were early models of constraint, influence, and scale. They describe how life responds to conditions rather than how conditions are created. That distinction was sufficient for survival. What mythology could not do was test itself. Science can. The danger comes when either framework claims exclusivity. When mythology hardens into doctrine, it resists revision. When science declares the universe meaningless by default, it oversteps its mandate. One confuses metaphor with mechanism, the other confuses mechanism for purpose. Understanding the planets as gods restores a middle ground. It allows us to see ancient belief as structured observation rather than delusion, and modern science as refinement rather than replacement. The next step is to follow this trajectory forward and ask what happens when gods give way to gravity, and whether something essential was lost in translation. The Myth of the Sun by Eric Leo. Chapter 6. From Gods to Gravity, How Science Renamed the Sacred. When science emerged as a formal method, it did not begin by attacking mythology. It began by refining it. The earliest astronomers were not iconoclasts tearing down gods. They were observers trying to describe the same sky with better tools and tighter language. What changed was not the subject, but the vocabulary. The sun did not lose its central role when astronomy replaced theology. It gained one. Copernicus moved it to the center of the solar system. Kepler described its influence through orbital motion. Newton explained that motion through gravity. At no point did the sun stop governing life on Earth. What disappeared was the need to describe that governance in human terms. This transition is often misunderstood as disenchantment. In reality, it was translation. Where mythology spoke of intention, science spoke of force. Where myth described character, science described mechanism. The same systems were being observed, but through a different lens. Precision increased. Predictability improved. What was lost was not truth, but narrative cohesion. Humans gained control over nature while losing a shared story about what that control meant. This is why modern science feels emotionally thin to many people. It answers how with extraordinary success, but it rarely addresses orientation. It tells us what the sun is made of, how old it is, and how long it will last. It does not tell us how to relate to it, or what obligations follow from our dependence on it. Ancient systems did both. Even today, remnants of this older worldview remain embedded in everyday life. The days of the week still carry planetary names. Sunday remains the sun's day. Saturday belongs to Saturn. These are not poetic accidents. They are fossils of a time when celestial motion structured social time directly. Calendars were cosmological tools before they were bureaucratic ones. When revolutionary France attempted to replace the traditional calendar with a rational, decriminalized system during the French Revolution, it failed not because it was inaccurate, but because it severed time from meaning. The new calendar worked mathematically. It did not work psychologically. Humans do not live by numbers alone. They live by rhythm. Science excels at isolating variables. Mythology excels at integrating them. The difference becomes clearer when we consider how ancient people must have experienced the sky. Without artificial light, the night sky was overwhelming. The Milky Way was visible. Planets were bright and unmistakable. Changes unfolded slowly but visibly over a lifetime. The sky was not background. It was presence. To live under it was to feel small, contingent, and dependent on forces you could track but not control. Modern humans rarely have that experience. We live indoors. We ignore the sky. We outsource timekeeping to devices that have no relationship to natural cycles. The cosmos still governs us, but we no longer feel governed. This creates the illusion that meaning has disappeared, when in fact our awareness of constraint has. Science did not remove intelligence from the universe. It removed intention as a necessary explanation. But intention and intelligence are not the same thing. Systems can relate without planning. Feedback loops can stabilize without awareness. And yet, at sufficient scale and complexity, relation begins to resemble cognition. This is where the modern conversation quietly circles back to ancient intuition. We now understand that complex systems can exhibit emergent behavior. Climate regulates itself through feedback. Ecosystems maintain balance through interaction. Neural networks learn without understanding. None of these systems are conscious in the human sense, but all of them behave intelligently relative to their function. The sun itself operates through cycles: magnetic reversal, solar maxima and minima, radiation output that subtly affects Earth's climate and biosphere. These cycles are measurable, predictable, and consequential. Ancient people experienced their effects without knowing their cause. Modern science measures the cause, but often ignores the experiential impact. In translating gods into gravity, we gained power, but lost humility. This loss matters because it changes how humans see their place in the universe. When the cosmos is framed as dead matter, governed by indifferent laws, responsibility shrinks. Meaning becomes optional. Ethics become negotiable. When the cosmos is understood as a set of interdependent systems that sustain life through balance, constraint, and feedback, responsibility becomes unavoidable. The ancient world erred by personalizing these systems too much. The modern world errs by depersonalizing them entirely. The argument of this chapter is not that science should reverse course, nor that mythology should be restored. It is that something essential was dropped in the handoff. The gods were not disproven. They were disassembled. Their functions were preserved. Their stories were not. If we want a worldview that is both accurate and livable, we may need to recover what mythology provided without surrendering what science has achieved. The next step is to ask whether intelligence itself might be a property that scales beyond individual minds, and whether planets and stars deserve reconsideration not as objects, but as systems capable of something closer to awareness.